We've mentioned Freud. Now it's time to go a little deeper so we can have another tool to help us understand modernist concerns and practices. I'm assuming that we all know who Freud is, even if you haven't studied him in any formal way. Freud had a bunch of crazy ideas, but he also had some really useful insights, and some of the ways he changed psychology as a field are still with us. For the purposes of this class, we're really only interested in early Freud. That's because later Freud, the one who came up with the idea of the ego, the id, and the superego, was unknown to the modernist writers at the time they were creating the works we'll be reading about in this class. But they all knew at least something about the ideas he popularized from about 1890 to 1910. Freud was interested in consciousness, like most people during modernity, but he was really interested in the unconscious. His early model of the psyche is usually called the topographical model, meaning it was like a map, and one of his ways of describing the unconscious was to call it the undiscovered country. Freud did not come up with the idea of the unconscious. A lot of people have been thinking about it for a while. In fact, if you think about consciousness much, you will pretty soon be playing with something like an idea of the unconscious, because there's so much about the way we respond to our world that can't be explained by thinking about consciousness alone. Think about someone you took an irrational dislike to. Sometimes we take quick dislikes to someone we've just met because they remind us of someone in our life who we dislike. But sometimes we really can't explain why person X rubs us the wrong way. The unconscious helps to explain these kinds of things. So why would we focus on early Freud when Freud himself kept wrestling with this idea and in fact later rejected the topographical model in favor of something more complex? Jacques Lacan, a Freudian psychoanalyst who later became a great theorist of the psyche himself, thought that Freud's later ideas were really a psychological reaction to Freud's early insights about the unconscious. Lacan thought that Freud was afraid of what he had discovered, and so he attempted to repress his insights by piling on layers of obfuscation. Freud had done this before. Very early Freud treated a number of young women who had symptoms of hysteria, a sort of generalized psychiatric disorder that doesn't rise to the level of insanity, but does make it hard to live a normal life. All of his patients reported being sexually abused in childhood. Freud initially posited that being sexually abused in childhood might have later psychological effects. But when he started talking about this theory, which probably seems like a kind of duh to us, he got a lot of pushback. So he repressed this theory and instead came up with the idea that little children are sexually attracted to their parents. This is a repression that means that all of his friends, the respectable men of Vienna, were off the hook for bad behavior, as it could now be blamed on children. Lacan says this episode is just a precursor to Freud's later repression of the topographical model. Freud did not invent the idea of the unconscious, but he popularized it. His ideas caught on in part because he was attempting to explain something people were wondering about. Why do I sometimes react in a way I can't explain? And partly because in the straight-laced world of late Victorianism, he dared to talk about sexual desire. So here's how Freud's topographical model worked. For a young child, all there is consciousness. The child is aware of everything they're aware of, and they have perfect recall of everything they've ever experienced. But at some point, something happens that is so traumatic, they can't function if they think about it. Freud said this could be any kind of traumatic event, being attacked by a dog, a severe illness, but usually he thought it was some sexual event. In early Freud, the traumatic event was stereotypically seeing one's parents having sex. But later on, he came up with the idea of the Oedipal complex and said the father's threat to castrate the boy was what caused the barrier of repression to form. Whatever. Like I said, Freud can be pretty crazy. The main idea, though, is that trauma happens, and what follows trauma is repression. When the trauma was repressed, it had to go somewhere, and where it went is into the unconscious. So you have consciousness, which now is only partial, because part of the person's consciousness has been separated to become the unconscious. So think of a map. On your left, you have consciousness stretching out into the distance. This is everything we are aware of in our thoughts, including memories that may not be immediately in consciousness, but that we could remember if triggered in some way. You probably don't go around saying your age to yourself the way 6-year-olds do, so your age is not in active consciousness at all times. But it's not repressed. Right now, you are thinking, I'm X, with the X standing for your current age. It wasn't hard to bring into consciousness. Back to our map. On your right, you have the unconscious. In the unconscious are not just that initial traumatic event that we repressed, but all the other things we can't stand to think about. All of that gets pushed out of consciousness, not by your will, but by an action of the psyche that is meant to protect you from trauma. Between consciousness and the unconscious is the barrier of repression. Think of it as a fence, not a wall. It is a special kind of fence, though. Its job is to guard the boundary between consciousness and the unconscious, keeping all those scary things out of our consciousness. The problem with the barrier of repression is that it is not solid, it's semi-permeable. So, on the one hand, you can't say, and now I will think my unconscious thoughts. But on the other hand, unconscious thoughts can intrude into consciousness. Freud said that the unconscious could be observed in jokes, dreams, slips of the tongue, and so on. That's why in movies that make fun of Freudian psychoanalysts, the patient might say something like, and then I went to see my mother. I went to see my wife. And the psychoanalyst is on that like a duck on a June bug. You said your mother. Basically, if you react in some over-the-top way to the color blue, or can't stand flowers in the house, or have any other little quirk of personality like that, Freud is going to say that's connected to something you've repressed, but that is poking at your consciousness through the barrier of repression. Now, all of this may be a bunch of hooey, but useful for reading the works of writers who encountered it and thought it maybe wasn't hooey. But whether it's hooey or not, we need to understand that the discourse of the unconscious is important because it marks a key distinction between modern people and those who had lived before. In earlier times, everyone could be known, either because butchers are like that, or because people in that family are like that, or for whatever reason. But in modernity, we can't even know ourselves, and so no one else has a hope of understanding you. And if we aren't knowable, that means that we are radically individual, which takes us back to the issue of the big T truth. In the Victorian era, people believed that science could figure out the big T truth. In the Middle Ages, religion explained the big T truth. In the Enlightenment, thinking things through would lead to the big T truth. But in modernity, you have a whole group of people who cannot know themselves and cannot be known to others. How are you to find the big T truth under these circumstances? Moderns acknowledged that you can't, that all you can hope for is a little small local truth that will always be partial and therefore wrong, like the small local truths that the 6 blind men had in the story when they encountered an elephant. Remember, one said, an elephant is like a wall, and another said, an elephant is like a fan, and another said, an elephant is like a rope, and another said, an elephant is like a hose. None of them were right about what an elephant was. They could only report on the small local truth they had, and even stitching these local truths together wouldn't lead them to the big T truth about the elephant. The unconscious is one of the ways moderns explained their inability to know the world with the same confidence their forebears had.